Welcome to the Bearfoot Miniatures Workshop channel, and in today's first video we're going to look at painting an Ultramarines glaive and making a multi-use diorama to put the glaive on, as well as something that can be used for taking pictures of models from any system. Now in today's video I got a glaive for the main channel off Games Workshop for just utilising in battle reports, and I thought it'd be quite good to make something different with it that I've not done before, and I've never actually made time, given myself time to make a diorama, and it's something that can be quite useful for displaying models on, for taking, for me, the start of game pictures, but something say you could use for Instagram or things like that to make the model look more finished and within the world. So I wanted a diorama that looked both multi-purpose, it didn't place anything too much, and I'm quite happy with how it turned out in the end. So we're going to be going over making the glaive, making the diorama, and it's not going to take too long. It is something that's achievable within a couple of days, because I got sent the glaive quite late compared to when this video needs to be released. So it's going to be something that is as fast as I could possibly do whilst maintaining quality. Now, if you like the idea of this sort of video, like painting videos, making terrain and dioramas, at this early point in the channel, please do all the YouTubey things, liking, commenting, subscribing. It lets me know that you want to see workshop stuff like this. It really will help massively within these early stages of the workshop channel. Now, for the diorama base, I wanted something that was multi-purpose, as I said, and I'd been looking quite a lot at Teutoburg Forest because of the Ultramarines tie into Romans, something that I wanted a broken down glaive, which had been inspired by looking at pictures of Dead Man's Corner outside of Carentan. So mixing that with Teutoburg Forest where the Romans get bashed in, I thought could make it quite an atmospheric piece, because what is heresy if not World War II and the Roman Empire in space? So I got down into making the glaive. Do you know what? It wasn't a terrible kit. I have hated the last few big Games Workshop kits that I've made. Saturnine Terminators, Saturnine Dreadnought, the Cathayan Sentinel have been the worst three kits I think I've ever built. The glaive, I was expecting a mammoth task going in, but actually it flew together quite nicely. So let's pause the actual building of the glaive at the point where I started doing some differing battle damage to it. And for this part of battle damage, I'd been watching, or I'd seen a few clips of El Miniaturistas on Instagram's hot iron poking into plastic models. So I thought I'd give it a go myself and decided to heat up some metal implements. So the first things to say is take care while you're doing something like this. You're working with fire and hot tools. I used a wooden handled implement for basically insulating my hand against any heat going along the metal rod. I got some pointed tools from a second-hand builder's merchants and essentially heated up the tool and then poked it into the model. I also tried out some plastic handled tools that didn't work too well because the handles got hot while I was using them, but I found it really effective in being able to just punch into the tank, work the tank, and actually utilising a lighter at the same time for a short amount of time to soften the plastic where the plastic was thicker, just allowed me to punch in some battle damage, and it was quite effective. So I just worked them through the tank, I worked chipping along the edges, and I didn't want to go overboard with this because you can actually do this at any stage because it's very easy. Although I've done this now during the modelling process, it's very easy to just go back, punch a new hole in if you think you've not done enough, and then paint it black and silver at a later stage. So less is definitely more, and take your time going into things. I then widened all of the punches with the bits of material that had splayed out, which is one of the benefits of using these tools. I put chipping marks into those splays of plastic that would represent the bulged and spalled metal on the battle damage. The next piece of battle damage that I wanted to add was a thrown track, and some reason to give a singular place to the model within this diorama. So I started out with the 2 pieces of track at the top and at the back, so that I had them in place while building, and I left the rest of the track till the end of the process. I then selected a place where I wanted the track to be thrown from, which is this front upper right as we're looking at the model. And I actually just cut the long piece of track along the teeth with a Stanley knife and a blade. And I then just drilled through the track from the side with a thin drill so that I can insert a pin into the track so it would be flexible and it would move in and out of position. I did this for all of the tracks along the right hand side up until the flat bit at the bottom, so that I could retrack and detrack at will, and it was then a flexible track. Now this is something that was easier than I thought it was going to be at the start, so it wasn't too much of a headache. I didn't get them all perfect, I just did them, and so long as a couple of the links within the 3 teeth of the track were pinned correctly, or at least pinned a little bit, the track became flexible within its position. Now I couldn't bend it too far afterwards, like it definitely will break if I bend it further than say the diorama required it as, but give it a go. I find it quite cool to just be able to detrack and detrack the tank, and it allowed me to both use the model as a gaming piece as well as within the diorama. The next piece that we're going to do on the glaive is actually get into the painting, because all of the battle damage that I wanted to do at this early stage had been done, and the rest will come as needed as I go through the tank. Actually, I didn't add any more, but if you did want to add more to your tank, it could come in these further stages. The first one we're going to do is, after spraying a matte black by Colour Forge over the entire model, get into the pre-shading step, which is going to give these nice colour variation within the initial paint job of the tank. The pre-shading step, I just go straight to white over the black undercoat, because utilising just controlled trigger pressure, I find I can get the grey midpoint by just utilising that white in smaller quantities. Over the turret, where I didn't know whether it was going to be either all white or blue and white at this stage, I give a grey over everything and just build up highlights to a pure white on those corners. Now, it's not something I did on this tank, but on a lot of pieces, what I've started doing now is giving a dry brush to the corners of the upper corners of the pre-shade. I'm using Tamiya Flat White with a bit of Flow Improver from Vallejo, just because those are the ones that I've got on my shelf, to build up this pre-shade. And I'm going to give it quite heavy, especially on the turret, where this first part of the light going top down will hit. And it's sort of like a zenithal. I'm calling it a pre-shade. You see it in a lot of places now that are using airbrushes. I learned it off the MKA course. And yet we're just going to start pre-shading the turret and then onto the tank. As I build up onto the tank, I'm also going to start trying to not hit areas of the flat panels as they meet other panels, so that I'm getting this variation between dark sitting next to light. And I know it's not 100% realistic, but it will look better in terms of popping the colours on your tank and getting nice saturated areas next to darker areas. To do this, I just take some card, which I know one side of at least is flat. I place it as a very easy mask over the darker area, and then spray against that so that I'm definitely not hitting the darker side on the underside. Repeating this across the entire tank, we get something like this, and it looks very white up to now. The sides I've shaded so that they're lighter at the bottom and darker at the top, and I've actually not glued on the two hatches on the side of the tank so that I can actually flip them and reverse them as we get further into the painting process. And that's just to give some more variation across the tank. I then mask out areas that I want to stay white, and that's going to be on this part the underside cutouts on the turret, as well as some cutouts on the side of the glaive. And this placement is simply up to you. I mask well over the pieces and then I'm going to cut them out with a knife just to make it easier rather than having to accurately mask each individual piece. I'm using frog tape for this, as I just find it actually a better tape than, say, Tamiya tapes, which I've never found adhered too strongly to the model. So I'm using builder's tape. And this is what we're left with. We've got the tank all taped up, and I've got the removable hatchway. Now I'm going to remove this now so that there's no areas that are missed when I'm painting the tank. And now is the time to start applying some colour. I've also taped a strip down the side of the tank, and I've used the feature of the vision slit and its raised armour panels for this. The paint that I'm going to be using is actually an artist ink, and it's an FW artist ink of Rowney Blue. Rowney Blue. So I'm going to be using that, and I'm going to add about 10% scale 75 Inktensity Blue to that mix. Now I've already mixed up a full batch for my entire army of this so that I can just get it from the pot. And I'm going to start applying that to the tank. I find it's a nice consistency with a bit of trigger control that I can just apply it directly to the tank. And I'm going to put a coating over the tank. Strictly, I should apply this to the entire tank before going back and applying a second coat any areas. But you might notice that I'm actually quite flippant with this. And so long as the area is dry, I test it out by going over a second time, and just have to remember going over that piece that I've been over it a second time already. It's nothing to massively stress about. Just remember to leave areas to dry before you go anywhere near them for the second and subsequent coats. I do end up thinning this mixture down just a little bit. I've used it unthinned before and been perfectly happy with it. I may just have needed to add more thinner here because my airbrush might have been a bit dirty or something like that. So just to stop it spitting, I add a bit of thinner. There's no real mix percentage that I've used for this. I wouldn't go above, say, 50%, but it's just anything. It's very hard to say on your personal setup at home for me to give recommendations of that. Say you're in a more humid environment, you might need more thinner. And it's something to just don't be scared of, especially with inks. They go through airbrushes really easy, and just try on a bit of card underneath your model until you get the correct effect and correct fluency as the airbrush sprays. The next piece for painting the tank is something that is both hated and loathed among model painters. I'm sure you'll be aware. It is the peel pawn section, where, fingers crossed, we won't have any too bad overspills or undercuts under the tape. Wish me luck. Tape and just a little bit. Nothing that we can't sort later with battle damage. There's just a little bit on the side of that turret next to the gun, and there's not much else. The harder bits are usually the parts that are easier to fix with battle damage and chipping later, because it's usually on raised surfaces or in the bullet catching areas where you've got armor panels meeting armor panels and raised surfaces. So it's never something to worry about too much unless you've got something that is across the entire panel, but even then it can be solved with battle damage. The next stage is to go through the entire model and go back to black with all of the areas that will be metallic, as well as anything that's going to be flat coated, such as the pipes, things like that. You don't need to see me do all of this, just I'm going to do anything that's not blue and white, this back to black. I then go on to the next dry brushing stage of all the metals. I'm quite liking AK gunmetal as well as an old Vallejo Steel colour to give a two-tone to the silvers. I start off with the gunmetal with a light dry brush. The reason I'm doing it as a light dry brush is that I quite like at the moment a black metal, as if it's a gunmetal. And that, I think, is just coming through painting more World War II miniatures at the moment, where you've got black metal guns. So I'm going to give a very light dry brush of this gunmetal and then go on to a steel dry brush. Now, to prevent your absolute boredom of me showing you me painting this model flat colours, I've listed on screen the colours that I've used now. So that's the AK Gunmetal and Vallejo Steel for the silvers. For the brass, because I like to use a non-gold colour so that it's not too heroic all the time, I use Scale 75 Victorian brass, and then I dry brushed it, a very light dry brush of Vallejo Steel again after. Finally, the cables underneath the laser destroyers were painted Acryl Burnt Red, and I didn't paint the other cabling on the tank, I just left them black. After this stage, the next thing I did was start applying transfers, because there was a nice break of going overnight at this point. So I always try and time it around that point. If you wanted to do these transfers before you painted the tank, right after the airbrush stage, then it's perfectly fine there, because so long as it's after that airbrush stage and before the battle damage, none of these matter coming in whatever order, I wouldn't say. So I select transfers. I've got a few names on there to get some visual interest, of like getting your brain active reading them. And I also try to pick out areas that could be quite plain or need visual breaks, such as along the top of this side panel, and break it up with some sort of border. So it's just areas that want a bit more pop, a bit more attention drawing to them. And I try and avoid places that don't want to be looked at as much, such as right next to the tracks. Saying that, there are a few pieces that I've put there, such as the vehicle number, the unit number, and all of these transfers I've just put where I think looks good. I quite like the Ultramarine symbol on the right of the vehicle, so it matches dude's shoulder pads. But other than that, I just tend to go what visually looks good, rather than something that is out of a book. It can provide good inspiration to be out of the book, but I would say always go with what looks good on the model. Now, I don't use microset for this. I've never seen the point. Water's always just worked fine for me. But microsol to dissolve the model, to dissolve the transfer after you've applied it on the model, to make it adhere around rivets and things like that, I do find really useful. So I'm going to apply this with a brush that is used for basically nothing else. And I don't find that I have to varnish plastic models before doing this step. It's something that, say, on resins, especially 3D prints, I have found that I need to do it, but to minimize the number of layers of varnish, I don't actually varnish it before this step. Now, if you want to be super safe, definitely varnish it, but I personally haven't. So that is a parade ground ready Ultramarines tank done there, and I'm going to go out and varnish the model with Pro Acryl matte varnish at this point, after giving 8 hours of drying time to those transfers. Now, I'm not always super strict with that. I don't find it makes too much of a difference, but for the 15 minutes of varnish drying the next day versus immediately doing it, I just tend to wait rather than doing it immediately. And good news, if you want your Ultramarines parade ground ready, this is the point that you can stop, and you've got a nicely painted Ultramarines tank ready to go out and blast your enemies. However, I'm going to go into more battle damage now, because I like my tank grim and dirty and full of combat damage and weathering. So the first thing that I'm going to do on the battle damage step is use Pro Acryl Coal Black in a sort of slashing motion with a dry brush. Now I'm going to load up the dry brush, wipe a bit off, wick a bit off like you would normally would, and I'm going to do this motion. Now, I've also done sponge chipping, but I find sponge chipping to be far too regular for what I like. In sort of a weird sense, it's far too regular in its own shape that you put down on the model, but also it's not directional enough for me, say, coming from the front of the tank. If, say, a stone has been thrown up by the tracks, there's no direction to sponge chipping in that way. And also, I don't find, say, impacts from shells, impacts from bullets, which would have a directional impact, to be given that by sponge chipping. So I like doing this sort of dragging motion with a dry brush, starting with coal black, along basically all of the edges across the tank to give a better effect for me. I find it's particularly good on white areas because it gives that sort of dusty battle damage effect to it. And I think it provides a good base layer to the next part that we're going to do, which is the Vallejo Steel again, because I want a large contrast in the chips at this stage. So any battle damage that you've already put on the tank, like physical battle damage, such as the shell holes, paint those black with this dry brushing step, and then in the next step, using Vallejo Steel, will establish that shorn metal look along both the edges and where the shells have impacted. As you can see from both of these steps, I'm quite liberal with how much paint I use. I'm not scared to get too much on there because actually the following steps, we're going to cover a lot of these lower sections of the tank especially, but the further weathering effects will tone down too much silver. Now that can be taken obviously too much of an extreme, but I like my tanks heavily weathered, so I just get it on there, especially with the black. If you don't like the placement of some of this while you're dry brushing it, you can sort of wet your thumb and then quickly rub an area out that you may have thought the placement was wrong. But just get into it. This is a real relaxing step if you can relax back into it. The next step is going to be doing heat effects on the guns, because this tank I'm imagining to be knocked out, and even if not there for, like, it's not like the Panzer of the Lake or something where it's been there for 70 years, but I'm not imagining in moment heat effects. So I'm using Inktensity Wood in order to just spray at the end of the barrels for both the laser destroyers and the glaive. I'm then also going to put this Inktensity Wood down the central strip. Now this is, if you're painting a glaive to be in use, might be a good area to put some oranges, some yellows, some whites to give a real heat glow. Ultramarines can also look good with a nice green going down that central heat bloom effect. But yeah, I'm doing Inktensity Wood because this is a knocked out glaive. Now next comes my favourite effect out of any of them. Now this is something that can be applied to any model. I do it on infantry, tanks, any civilian vehicles. I do it on terrain. It's a mixture between Tamiya Flat Earth and Tamiya Flat Flesh. Big up to Matt Kane from the original MKA courses for putting me onto this, and it's something I've probably done over what he would recommend, but I absolutely love this. So I'm going to mix those two up 50-50. I've got my pre-mixed pot actually of this because I use it so frequently, and I'm going to start applying that to the tank. Now this is something that you can also use to make areas lighter, because on initial pass with this dust you can make something, it sort of appears hazy and a bit whiter. I'm going to do multiple passes of this, so I'm going all around the bottom of the tank, and the more I put on, the browner it's going to end up looking. I'm going up to about halfway with the dust at a real light haze, and then as we get to the bottom edges, it's getting more and more brown. I'm going to do this all over the tracks, so as you can see I've moved off the movable track there, so that we can see on the running gear, and it's going to be my initial base layer to a bunch of muds that we'll put on later. But first we're going to give some streak effect to the model. I'm going to do a way of doing this sort of like leopard spotting, where you put dots of concentrated oil paint at various points along the model. I'm just going to show this on one side, and then we're going to use a slightly damp brush of white spirit to basically streak down the model. So I'm going to place in semi-random places with my ochre oil paint, and this can be any brown ochre, or I found this like yellowy brown ochre to work best for Ultramarines. It doesn't have to be Winsor & Newton like I'm using here. It's just, you can use any cheap oil paints. Sometimes the cheaper the better. So give it a try out with a £1 oil paint first before you run out to the shops and go with these Winsor & Newtons. Use a brush that you're not going to use for anything else, like with Microsol. Do not use it for anything else. And as you can see, I'm just going to streak down from these concentrated spots to get sort of rain and splash effects. I'm going to do the same thing with MIG Splashes Dry Earth, and that's so The next step, which will be doing a real mud splash effect, is tied into colour-wise with the streaking effects. So I'm going to leopard spot again using my same oil paint brush to do this across the model. Now you may have noticed I've not actually varnished the model that frequently during all these stages. It's not something that I've found to be a problem, especially on plastic models. Unless you're really pooling white spirit for a long period of time, it's not something that I've found had a negative impact on the model. It also helps to use, if you've done varnish in previous steps, a matte varnish, so the actual oil paint or streaking effects stains the paint job beneath rather than acting like a panel line wash, which you would get with a gloss varnish. So if you do want to varnish your model, I suggest that you use a matte varnish before these steps. Using a gloss varnish all the time, especially before oil paint, seems to be something that is used much more in the hobby sphere rather than, say, the military modelling sphere, where they're much more willing to just use oil paint straight on top of an acrylic paint job. So it's something that I try to do so that I get the nice staining across the panels of the model, and then I'll varnish at the end with a matte varnish right at the end of the process in order to tie it all in and protect the paint job. The next step that I do, one of the final steps, is the AK Engine Grime, and I'm just going to put this around the vents and around places on the exhausts to just give a bit more contrast between the shiny side or buffed bit of the exhaust, around the collars basically. So I'm just going to put this into those places, and then because it's an enamel paint, I can thin it with white spirit and just get a nice feathering out of the paint across the entire piece of pipe. Now the next two stages are some of my favourite stages of the entire thing. I think it gives the nicest effect across the model out of anything, and it's because it's a physical built-up effect on top of the paint job. It's not something that is flat trying to represent a physical effect. So I'm going to use the MIG Loose Ground, and then I'm going to use the MIG Dry Earth, and then in the next step MIG Loose Ground, and I'm going to flick it off a toothbrush. And I'm using quite a stiff toothbrush for this so that it flicks all across the model. And the nice thing about this is, even though they dry quite fast, they also reactivate with white spirit after a large amount of time. I've even played with it 6 months later in the past on certain models. So I'm going to use the first effect, the Dry Earth, which is the much lighter effect, so that then the Loose Ground, which is darker and representing more fresh, less dried out dirt, goes on top. So we've got a realistic patterning to when and where these effects are randomly placed on the model. So yeah, it goes first Dry Earth, or your lighter choice, and then secondarily you've got Loose Ground. This can then be turned into streaks, it can be blended by adding white spirit to a brush and blending it, and it can just be played about with. If you don't like where something has gone onto the model, as you can see, I've a couple of times got a brush, got some white spirit on it, and just removed the effect. It adds to streaking, it adds to sort of the haziness of dust on the model, and I really love these effects. It's something I first discovered by reading MIG's Weathering magazine, which I suggest you pick up a copy. It's really good. Especially, it's military modelling, but it's something that can be applied to all modelling, is particularly heresy that can have styles like that. Yeah, and I just build up these effects across the model. And it's something that I apply particularly around where the tracks will kick up dirt to. When you're flicking the paint, it will obviously flick all over the model. Like, I try and control it not doing that, but especially on the top of the tank, I've just then blend it out with a cotton bud with a bit of white spirit on, and it's just an additional streaking effect. Its randomness, I find, actually enhances the look of the model and the natural placement of dirt on the model. So after I've hit it with this Loose Ground and I've blended it in all through the tracks, all through the bottom edges of the tank, this is where I'm going to stop on this glaive, because it's something that's ground to a halt because of the battle damage, and just fits into the diorama with that. Now, if I was doing an active tank, I'd actually go one step further and put wet mud, which is a thicker mix, to flick onto the tank, and it builds up with this sort of gloss and large bodied effect to give that real fresh wet mud effect. The final thing I do is re-pick out areas of battle damage that I want to be super fresh on the tank. So I'm picking out the area of battle damage I put on the track, because that wouldn't have got any more mud over it after that shot was done. Because the tank has ground to a halt, no more mud's accumulating, so I pick out those real fresh elements and give them the Vallejo Steel again. And that is the very final step on this tank. So that is the final step of making this glaive, and actually I can say that I really enjoyed getting back into, and my teeth stuck into, some heresy stuff, combining with the newer techniques, or older techniques I should say, that I've learned doing more military modelling style and doing historical style stuff, and having those different considerations within my brain. Hopefully you've seen some different techniques and different things that you might not have considered before, like the mud effects. It's something that I love doing on my models because it gives that textured look and also that multi-layered look, so that when you're looking at a model on the table you see one thing, and as you draw it closer to your eye it gives multi-stages of interest and visual depth to the model. And with the glaive being done, we need something to put it on to make it a diorama. So let's start off with building the base. So the first thing I did, and to make it easy on myself, was to establish a size I wanted for the... So the first thing I did to make it easy for myself was to establish a size that I wanted for my diorama base. I used a 300 by 200 millimeter piece of foamed PVC to set the size, and then used a mitre block to cut pieces of timber mouldings at a 45-degree angle on each. Having this size allowed me to use the foamed PVC to build up two edges of the diorama beyond the timber moulding. This gave me a nice framework to have two edges built up and have a bit of relief to the model. Using the foamed PVC, I was able to then use the same measured edge to align with the base of the timber moulding, so that I could match them exactly and they wouldn't be too much messing about. I drew a line across the foamed PVC that would give me the maximum extent of the raising terrain, and then I could mark on each the top and the bottom cut that I could then cut with a knife to give me the rolling landscape. All I needed to remember to do was take off the width of one of the PVCs, so in this case it was a 3mm PVC, off the length of one of the two of them to allow them to slot together like an L along the back side of my diorama. And I glued all of that L shape together using super glue, because I'm very impatient, especially at this step, and we got the nice L of the back of the relief of the terrain glued together. Success! But going on to a less successful note, I next started with some foam. So I marked out the length of the inside measurements of the beading that I wanted. So that was 300mm by 200mm of the internal measurements. I used a box to create a right angle and cut out the foam to what I wanted. Now this doesn't have to be any special foam. I used a closed cell cheap foam from the Builder's Warehouse, because this was going to be entirely covered up and doesn't need to stand any particularly battering, because it's going to be used as a diorama rather than a gaming piece. I used a hot wire cutter to cut this out. You do it in a well ventilated area because it does give off fumes. I had the windows everywhere open. Sadly, I can't use my extractor fan while I'm recording because it's just not in a position that I can both record and use it. But if you were doing it yourself, 100% use everything you can. And I was wearing a filtration mask for these steps. Now, because I'm incredibly lazy, what I did was hot glue gun my foam to my existing L of the relief. This was slightly smaller than the internal measurements, so after putting together the rest of the framework, I had to bulk out the edges that didn't in fact have something to stick them together. If I'd have had more time, I'd have 100% used grip fill to do this step. However, I was under a bit of time pressure at this point, so I end up super gluing it to give it a bit of tack and then filling the entire thing with hot glue and coffee stirrers. And what I did is I put down a sheet of greaseproof paper so the hot glue wouldn't stick to anything beneath and I could easily peel off this final result. I tack each corner with hot glue and I stuff down coffee stirrers in the gap to give something for the hot glue to push against. So I'm using like a minimal amount of hot glue. And essentially, yeah, I just fill out the entire thing with hot glue and coffee stirrers. I don't come right up to the top because that's the actual final level of the piece is something that we can deal with later after we've shaped the landform. Next up comes me just checking that everything's the size that I want before I proceed too far into the build of the diorama. As you can see, I did this concurrently with the glaive, so I'm just up to the spray painting it black at the moment, but it's a nice size for what I wanted. After deciding that, what I'm going to do is get into the step of actually shaping the initial part of the landform. Using the back edges as a guide, I'm going to cut down to make the hill, and as I said before, things go wrong, and this case, it was my hot wire cutter completely broke during the final step, it seemed. So I'm just on cutting it with a knife at the moment. Now this can get messy. I had a bin right next to me because of that, because I don't want bobbles of foam all over my room, but it just shows that you can just press on and do things in non-optimal ways and get a result at the end that you want, because it wasn't going to matter. I'm going to use a sculptor mold like material to cover up this foam, so just having it a bit bobbly at this stage doesn't matter. Next stage is that sculptor mold stage. So I'm going to use my own mixture for that. Now this is something that's out in a few places. Luke's APS did it ages ago, and it's something that's incredibly good and cheap. So I'm going to get casting plaster, some shredded tissue paper, something that's absorbent basically, so to bulk out the casting plaster, and I'm going to mix that with water. And you're going to want to go for something that's sort of cottage cheese in its consistency. I'm not too accurate with this all the time. I sometimes go for a 50-50 casting plaster and the amount of paper in there. The paper has gone through a shredder, it's been then whizzed up with a blender, and as I say, I'm not too accurate with the amount that goes in there. I'm just looking for the final consistency. I apply this over the top of the foam, and it's quite a nice sealing layer on top of that foam, because we're going to be able to paint it, spray it, all stuff like that that you wouldn't normally be able to do on top of foam after this clay layer has gone over the top. So I just use this, I wipe it over the entire model, and I just then smooth it out. As the mixture dries, it goes from this mush that is quite hard to actually get a smooth top on. But if you, as you go through the model, especially after one this size, at the end of filling it out, I could then smooth it over with my finger and get this nice rolling landscape to it. It was also at this stage that I'd actually gone back and just used a knife to cut in a stream across the front side of the model, because I wanted that a bit of extra visual flair to it and to try out some new techniques. Even though I hadn't been planning on having a stream at the start, I thought it'd just be a nice addition. So what we're left with is this nice terrain model. It's fairly smooth. I've gone and sprayed it black in case of any following stages missing areas of the ground, and that's like dirting and putting rocks on, things like that. If there were any gaps, all you would see beneath was black, which I wouldn't read as anything that is to worry about, rather than white, which will really stand out in a natural environment. So the next step is to start adding bits of detail. Weirdly, I do this now rather than before, or this particular step now, rather than after the dirting step, because I want them to be protruding through the base layer. I don't want them to be placed on top. The base layer will also help to fix these longer elements to the base. So I get a wallpapering brush that normally applies glue to the back of wallpaper, and I found it's really good for making reeds from that just poke up from stream beds. So I make them into little clumps. I put a dot of super glue on the bottom of each, and then I stick them onto the diorama using that super glue. Sometimes they're a bit hard to get to Sometimes they're a bit hard to make stick directly up, and in those cases I drill a little hole in the diorama, in the sculptor mould mixture, and I put them within that. Now I'm trying to vary the height within these, so sometimes I'll stagger the brush as I cut them, but a lot of the time they get this natural staggered grass look anyway within each clump. So with that, with the clumps of long grass in, we're at the stage where we're ready to start adding aggregates to the model. The first one is going to be Kraut cover Riverbed. Who knew? It's going in the riverbed. So we start putting PVA across the entire length of the riverbed. So I'm using both small bits of the aggregate, Ainsley Harriott style, sprinkling it from on top afar, and then I'm putting larger pieces of stone in there to give bits of visual incident and interest across the stream. Think those small creeks that you would get in the mountains and uplands, rather than having a clear riverbank that you would get lower down a river where the river cuts much faster. And you know what? This is the first time I used that Kraut cover mix, and I was really impressed with it. It has that nice rounded edges that streams would give as the erosion cuts round rocks. So it might be a bit of a premium price, but I enjoyed it on this first usage of it. So my next step is to put aggregate across the entire model. And so I apply PVA, and then I use dried sieved dirt, simply dried sieved dirt from on the ground outside. Who knew? I don't like personally mixing it with things like grouts. I just don't like the effect. I don't like how grout indents too easily. When you're applying it, I find it takes on shapes of anything you touch it with until it's fully set, and when it's fully set, I find it sort of too smooth. So I use 100% dried dirt. Now, if you are drying out dirt, you can do this both in the oven, or a lot of the time, I just leave it vaguely near a radiator in a bag for life. So it naturally just evaporates all the water from it. As you can see, I was impatient and did this while the PVA on the stream was still drying. If you do that, if you make a mistake, it's no worries. You just put some PVA on any area that you need to reapply the riverbed, and I simply just put more riverbed by Kraut cover on top of any areas that I'd make mistakes on. Now the next section is a bit of a choice, because I was doing a multi-purpose diorama that I could not just have the glaive on, but take pictures of normal squads at the start of games or when I finish painting some models. I'm going to put a path across the length of the actual model. If you were doing a set piece diorama that's always going to have a tank on, say, you might want to do churned earth behind the tank on both sides of the track and not in front of the tank. Because of this multi-purpose nature, I'm going to put a path the length of the model and not under both sides of the tank. So, having placed that glaive on there, I'm actually really happy with it at this point. I think it's got a nice contrast between the tones, and we've not yet weathered the glaive, but that is coming up in alternate timeline. So, I'm going to use a mixture of two things for my path. It's going to be light earth by AK, and it's going to be wet mud by AK. These just come in bigger quantities than the MIG effects do. They're essentially the same thing, but I like the MIG effects for a tank. I think they actually go on better, and using those on a diorama and on terrain would be far too expensive, so I'm using the AK bigger pots on that. I position the glaive where I approximately want it to be, and I draw, sort of pencil in one side with a bit of the wet mud. Now, utilising these two products together, I can have natural variation in tones across the path. So rather than using one across the entire length, which I actually really don't like as a look, it's too consistent, I think the perfect use of these diorama textures are to use multiple across the entire lengths. And I just sort of paint it on like any other paint that you would, like across a layer along the length, and then I sort of wet blend the other colour onto it. I don't think it matters too much which you start with. I like starting with the darker texture because I think it's closer to this dirt that I've put on. So if rather than putting a lighter texture on first and having this stark contrast between the two. The next thing I'm going to do is start adding some tufts of grass, especially these marshy style tufts from Gamer's Grass, and I'm going to add them more around where the creek bed is than anywhere else. In fact, I'm going to largely leave the north side of the path as we're looking at it free of tufts, because they're going to be done in a longer style grass. The southern side of the path I'm going to do with some tufts, just adhering them. I don't trust the sticky bit on the bottom of these tufts, on any of them. Anything I apply them to, I always dip them in PVA and then onto the model, diorama, terrain, anything that you're using. So I apply these here in a bit of a randomised pattern, getting close and far away from the stream. And then the next step, I'm going to start applying some blended turf and some fine turf from Woodland Scenics. So I get those turfs ready to sprinkle on as soon as the PVA has been done. I put the PVA around the path where the grass will have been trodden down, as well as the shorter sections to give more marshy feel around the riverbed, because I want multiple sort of biomes within this diorama to give as much visual distinction as I can. Get the PVA down, and then I sort of Ainsley Harriet the green grass and blended turf, both of which are fine flocks, and I just put those around the model and then shake off the entire base so that they're minimally on there. It's not a big stack that's really dense of green. It's something that is blended in with the dirt layer below and not too vibrant. Now the next step, I wanted something that would be a universal grass cover to the base. And for that, I'm going to make my own mix of static grasses. Now this is something that I do quite often, you see lots of people doing, and I'm going to be applying it with a Woodland Scenics static grass applicator. So it's large enough that I can apply multiple static grasses all at once. I'm going to start separately with a 2mm real old Games Workshop grass mixture, Citadel grass mixture from the 90s, I think it was. But DCA Flock does a scorched grass that you can essentially get this 2mm static grass from as well. I'm going to apply a full layer to all of the areas of the model that are currently just the dirt. Now, because I want to apply this all as one stage, I'm going to do my mixture of a multi-blended static grass all at once. And I sort of just base it on feel. There's no particular recipe, but the entire thing, and this will be in the description below along with all the other things that I've used in this guide, is 4mm dark green by Woodland Scenics, 4mm medium green, 4mm light green, 7mm light green, 12mm light green, and 6mm scorched grass by Kraut cover. And I lean heavily on that 6mm scorched grass by Kraut cover because I think having this yellowy grass at the top both looks quite summery, as grass is called like seed pods, but also it could be dead grass in winter or just scorched grass year round. Now, I'm going to get all this prepped so that the glue that I'm going to use for the initial 2mm layer is still wet, so I can just apply it all in the same passes. I also don't think you should stress with too much of that mixture. Find something that you quite like the look of. I've basically applied equal parts of each of those grasses. I basically applied equal parts of each of those types of grass, and then I've added probably 2 parts extra of the scorched grass by Kraut cover. Now it's something that's just going to give natural variation across the grass, having those different colours in there. But if you are just starting out, you've not just got all of those grasses to hand, don't worry about it too much. It's not going to make too much of a difference. It's more important that you start enjoying making dioramas and terrain rather than worrying about specific grass mixes. The next step that I'm going to do is apply tacky glue to all of the dirt areas of the model where I want the grass to be. I spray it just all over. I just tip out the tacky glue and then spread it about with the brush. There's nothing too much to say about this stage. It's just putting glue all over the model. I prefer tacky glue than PVA because I think it helps the static grass stay more upright as you're applying it, rather than falling down after it's come out your shaker. And then I get my 2mm dark grass, scorched grass, anything that you want. Just I think it's a bit of a darker mixture than you want for your longer mixtures. So I get my 2mm static grass and I just applied them evenly, quite a light layer across all of the model to give that initial base coverage. Now, if it's your first time using a static grass applicator, welcome to the dark side. I used to avoid them like the plague, but actually I really like using them now. Put down greaseproof paper underneath the model or diorama that you're doing, so that when you finish, you can tip off the static grass onto the greaseproof paper, nothing will be stuck onto there, and then you can tip it back out into your applicator or into the box that you store in the static grass, and it's completely changed my thoughts on getting that static grass everywhere. I then bunch up bits of the static grass that I've applied initially, just with my fingers, just to get a bit more clumping. Who knows how much good it actually has done across the model, but it does provide a thicker, tuft effect to those areas. I'm then going to apply my longer static grass mix. Now, particularly with this step, but also with the previous step, make sure you've got your static grass applicator close enough to the model. It's something that when I just dabbled with static grass applicators, I was holding it too far away and it just wasn't working, but getting it within sort of like 4 centimeters of the model as you're dusting it across really does help with that application. And just keep going and keep going. Unless you want a very thin grass, just do more than you could ever possibly think that you want on there. Multiple passes and get the grass built up. Now, the next thing that I'm going to use is a little handheld vac. I got this for $17.99, I think it was, from Aldi, and it's well worth getting, and they're available on Amazon. This is both going to help stand up the static grass, but also keep my hobby desk clear. And when that was dry, I basically just used a scalpel to go round and trim off any pieces of excess grass that had adhered to surfaces I didn't want it on, off the model. And this is just something that happens. The glue runs onto pieces that you don't want, and it's worth just waiting until everything's adhered and then slicing it off in a solid piece. The next thing is water effects, and this is going into the mindset of showing you everything that went right and everything that went wrong. So I've been on a quest to find the easiest way to do our water effects for a long time now. I've used epoxy resins. I've used epoxy resins successfully. I've used UV resins. They're both a bit of a faff in their own ways. Now, Woodland Scenics Realistic Water Effect is something I've had my eye on for a while. It's just a bit pricey for what it is. Now, I decided to use it without reading the bottle. It says that you shouldn't use it next to PVA. So if you're going to use this, give your diorama a varnish, particularly a gloss varnish, so it's an impermeable barrier, before you apply your water effect. Because what I found upon using this was that actually a lot of my water effect drained away into the wider diorama. And also, when I sealed it with Mod Podge, it went a bit cloudy, because Mod Podge must be based somehow similar to PVA. I thought it was actually just varnish, but it gave a bit of a cloudy effect. Now, the final result isn't something I'm unhappy with, but it is something to bear in mind. So how did I do these specific things? I poured out some realistic water effect into a clean plastic cup, and I tinted it with some speed paints, express paints, contrast paints, anything that comes to hand. I wanted to use browns or off browns to represent the dissolved sediment in the stream. So I've made sure that either end of this stream is dammed, and the centre of it is obviously filled with my sculptor mould style mixture. And I've got to say, this initial pour, when it went on, I thought looked perfect. It was exactly the right consistency, what I wanted. It filled the space how I wanted. It, alas, just wasn't to be of this initial pour. But I think next time coming back to it, what I do is just spray it with gloss varnish, do the water effect, or maybe gloss varnish then matte varnish, so that it was the right colour and transparency, pour the water effect, and then that would give gloss to anything that I wanted to be gloss. And as I said, this is all in the quest of the easiest water effect to use. So me trialing it, as I said, I've used epoxy resins before. It's just a nightmare because it takes 48 hours to dry and things like that. So then you've got worrying about whether anything's going to spill on it or dust is going to get on there. So yeah, I quite liked using this water effect. I've just got to bear in mind the instructions and actually read them before I use the product. So after it had gone wrong, sort of drained away, I applied Mod Podge across the entire stream length, thinking that that would seal the stream bed. When that was dry, I then mixed up another batch of realistic water, adding the tints that I wanted, and then poured it on again. It was a bit yellower than the previous time, but I can't complain, it all stayed there. It did have a bit of like a white scum across like the rocks where the Mod Podge had been built up. So potentially it didn't go perfectly, but in the end, I'm actually quite happy with the result. It doesn't draw the eye too much. It's just learning for the next time. Because at worst comes to worst, you just rip off the effect, you rip off the stones beneath it and have another go. You've not got to be too stressed. So long as you have dammed either side of your water effect so it's not spilling all over your desk, there's nothing stopping you ever just redoing something. It's not got to be something that you're worried about doing. So the final touches to this diorama are going to be adding some bushes and elements of life in that way, some vertical elements other than the model. So I made my own bushes that will feature a video of later in the year, around June, I think. So I'm going to use those. It's beyond the scope of this video being an hour long already. In the meantime, I definitely recommend MIG Ammo fine bushes, and they come in a variety of colours and are really good quality. I also use some trees on here. Again, MIG does some excellent trees. So I used a small multi-stem that I made from Woodland, Scenics stuff and clump foliage, but I also used a pine tree that I got off Temu. They're dirt cheap. And yeah, it's just with those vertical elements, the diorama was coming together. All it needed was the real micro scale, and that I use Greenstuff World Tall Shrubbery. Now, I have two variations of these, both the red and the white, and I like to use the white to represent cow parsley, which is really dominant during like sort of late spring across all hedgerows. And I cut these down so that I get both very small shrubs as well as the taller shrubs that you just normally get with this set. You can even tease them out into single pieces and have them coming up as flowers through your grass. And yet this all tied it together. The only thing it needed was a tech marine to be assessing the damage. So that was the final element on our diorama. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like and comment, subscribe to the channel. As a new channel, it's going to massively help with doing more videos and getting more content out to you. If you want a diorama made for yourself or any terrain commissions, get in contact with me, get in contact with Greenstuff, who is going to be doing this channel alongside me. And what do you think about the diorama? Hopefully you liked it. Hopefully you liked that I left in the failures on the diorama, but let me know what you think in the comments below. And with that, I'll see you on Thursday on the gaming channel, where Matt's Custodies take on my Iron Warriors to fight over this glaive, where Phil Burno is going to showcase some MDF terrain that made its way into a book and made me not hate MDF terrain anymore. See you in that one in a bit.